Thank you very much, everybody. So I would like to kind of adjust whatever I had planned to talk about to wherever your questions are. Primarily, we're hoping to look at kind of older, ancient, kind of foundational issues around Israel and Palestine to kind of set us up for understanding it. Maybe at another time, a talk about kind of contemporary issues that take place and unfold after the Second World War. So most of today will be kind of in the ancient world. We will get up to about 100 years ago. I will also be not completely covering everything that happened in the last 4,000 years in the region, but trying to touch on some key points. And then if you have questions, maybe we'll ask them as things unfold rather than to wait until the end. So the first slide that I have is just how many names rather can one place have. So it's a political term today to talk about Palestine or to talk about Israel. There are some school books in certain countries you'll go to, and Israel isn't even listed on the map, but that if you look at the territory, it is Palestine. And then, of course, there are some who say that Palestine no longer exists and that there is only the country Israel. And then there are some who say, there may be a possibility of a two-state solution. But going back, even to 4,000 years ago, the place was known by many places, by many names. Palestine, it gets called the Holy Land. It's the land of milk and honey, also called the Promised Land, Canaan, and Israel. So we'll touch on some of those names and why those names changed. Jump over to here. This link isn't going to pop up for us, so I have this picture, which is from a political website that is trying to make a point about the defense of Israel. But what is interesting to me, and I try to get this across to young people, is Israel's really small. So in terms of its geographic size, it's that little blue kind of slash in the middle of the United States. So you can get a sense in terms of its relative size. It's pretty small. It's smaller than Maine. It's a little bit bigger than Massachusetts, and it's kind of tilted on its axis in that way. But so you drive from one end of Massachusetts to the other. It takes you 2 or maybe 3 hours, and then from top to bottom it would take you less than an hour. And that gives you a sense of Israel's or Palestine, depending on who we are, on its size. In some way, its small size makes it more significant, and really it's more of its location as a crossroads of the Fertile Crescent that really make it particularly significant. But I think it is small relative to the amount of influence it has and the amount of news coverage and the amount of conflict, turmoil, and so on that take place there. So we'll let our slide change. Oh, update ready to install. We're not going to install this update. This is awesome. Are you guys seeing that? It's popping up saying that I need to install. There we go. Next slide. That's where okay, next slide. Here we go. So given its location in the Fertile Crescent, it is going to have major significance in 3 of the world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're called religions of the book because they all accept some of the early Jewish scriptures as sacred texts. And so, strangely, these are cousin or sibling religions, and maybe because of that, there are so many conflicts over who has correct interpretation and who deserves to own the property. We're going to look closely at some of the claims from these different religions to why they believe they should have the property. We've got a slide here. So the book of Exodus. The story of Exodus, Jews are enslaved in Egypt, and God promises them, stick with me, and I will get you out of this land. I'll return you to a territory in the Fertile Crescent that your ancestors had inhabited in the past. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but you can see it up there. Essentially, God says, follow me, we're going in. I'm going to, bring great power before all of your enemies. We'll smite your enemies. You will inhabit this land. And then don't let the other people who already live there anymore. This is your land. Don't intermarry with them. Don't worship their idols. This is your land. Now, today in the debate or in the argument over whose land this is, it's not often that there's a political argument for why the Jews should have the land that really develops in the late 1800s and then into the early and mid 1900s. But this is the kind of fundamental basis for why the Jews see this as their homeland. In their sacred text, God delivers them from slavery and says, I'll clear out this land. This is your land. Eventually, around 70 AD or 70 CE in the Common Era, the Roman Empire comes to colonize Mesopotamia, parts of Mesopotamia, and the Middle East. And sort of, it seems as though they had read George Orwell, 2,000 years ahead, where they said, keeping this name, this is sometimes called Israel, sometimes this is called the Kingdom of Judea. Those are political, kind of nationalist names. And if they just decided we'll colonize them and we'll let them keep those names, then the Jews would have a sense of identity with the land. This is our land, right? This is the promised land. And so very deliberately and manipulatively, the Roman Empire said, we're going to call this Palestine. And they get Palestine from the Philistines, who were one of those groups that in the book of Exodus, God said he would smite, I think we got the Philistines, in the second line there. I will establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines. So these are one of those groups like the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Hivites who had previously inhabited the territory. And the Romans are like, let's just pull that name out of history as a way of dispossessing kind of the Jews from this territory. Even while the Jews continue to live in the territory, the Romans call it Palestine, so that there's no longer, they disassociate, they disconnect the name of the place with the people who they have colonized. Really quick history of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire weakens to manage itself. It splits in half. Simultaneously, Christianity is spreading through the Roman Empire. So you have in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which is really just the Eastern Roman Empire. They take control over Palestine, and it's really more like there's not really a change, right? It had been Roman territory, and now it's just Eastern Roman territory. And now the Eastern Roman Empire is a Christian empire, and so the Holy Land, or Palestine, continues to be Roman territory, but now it is Roman Christian territory. Jesus, born a Jew, lived in Palestine, died in Palestine. Christians believe that's where he rose from the dead. It's where where the Last Supper took place, from where his apostles, went out and spread the faith throughout the Roman Empire. And so Palestine becomes a key pilgrimage site for Christians. As Islamic power grows in the 600s, the Byzantine Empire retreats from Palestine, and Muslims take over Palestine, leading to the Crusades. I'm not going to get into a big talk about the Crusades, but the Christians, both in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, and then the Western Christians in Western Europe kind of see Palestine as belongs to them. Christians should be able to have pilgrimages there, and that's one of the sparks that's going to cause the Crusades. But Christians believe that they have right to the territory because of the role of the Byzantine Empire, because of the life of Jesus that took place in Palestine, and because of the numerous kind of shrines and churches that are built to kind of commemorate moments in Jesus' life. So as Muslim power grows, what's interesting, so politically, Islam is expanding in the 600s, but Jerusalem, which is a city within Palestine, and Palestine more broadly, has significance to the development of Islam. That isn't just, oh, here's a place where a lot of people live, let's go and conquer it. Muhammad saw Islam not really as a new religion, but as really a continuity. He was blending, he as part of living in this kind of crossroads region. He's living further south in the Arabian Peninsula along the Hijaz, but another trade route where he's coming across merchants who are Jews, merchants who are Christians. He himself comes from a tradition of Arab polytheism. He's got all of these different ideas. He's kind of a cosmopolitan figure. He's got all these different ideas. And so as Islam develops, it's pretty clear that many of these themes and ideas from Judaism and from Christianity are blended in what's going to become Islam. So if you grab a Quran and you look in the index, you'll find Moses, you'll find Jesus, you'll find other figures from the Hebrew Bible and from the New Testament. And so Jerusalem, as a city in Israel, Palestine, sacred to the Jews and sacred to Christians, becomes a sacred site to Muslims. And the first Muslims didn't pray to Mecca, but in fact prayed to Jerusalem. Right? So everybody knows, Muslims, will, wherever they are in the world, will pray directed toward Mecca. But originally they prayed toward Jerusalem. And when Muslims believed Muhammad had his night journey from the Arabian Peninsula, he was brought by God, Muslims believe, to Jerusalem, to the site where Abraham, kind of founder of kind of Judaism, was asked by God to sacrifice his own son to kind of build the covenant between the earliest Jews and their God. So Muslims believe that in Muhammad's night journey, he shows up, God brings him to the same place, right? And from there he ascends into heaven and meets with God. So clearly this is a place of great significance to all three religions. It becomes almost impossible to have an argument or have a discussion of like, well, it's more special to the Jews, or it's more special to the Muslims, or it's more special to the Christians. Built into their texts and their beliefs is the sacredness of this city, which is a key reason for its the intractability or the great challenges of ownership and meaning in this territory. So those all exist let's see, we can say going back to, the Crusades or the 1200s, 1300s into the 1400s. And we say, by the 1400s, the territory is under Muslim Turkish control, the Ottoman Empire. The Muslim Turks allow... there are Jewish populations there, although essentially the Jews are in a diaspora spread out across the world, largely after the Romans finally kicked them out in 70 AD. They end up moving across North Africa and in all parts of Europe. The Christians are allowed to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land, but by the 1400s, the Ottomans own the territory, and then that brings us all the way up to the 20th century, when we'll start to talk about some of the issues that you may start to see in the headlines today. I know there was an election last week in Israel, and one of the issues was, should there be a two-state solution? Will there be an Israel and a Palestine as two legitimate governments? Or should Jewish settlements in Palestinian territories be allowed to expand? And a lot of that relates to some of these 20th century complications. So for a little while, we'll talk about some of these issues. And for 10th graders, I see some of my 10th grade students out there, a lot of this is what's going to be unfolding in the kind of coming weeks and months of our classes. So when World War I happens, you have major empires being destroyed. And as they relate to the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire's destruction unleashes a series of, or makes apparent a series of problems across the Middle East. We won't get into today issues with Iraq, but the country Iraq is essentially created. It's cobbled together out of pieces of the Ottoman Empire. Also, this place called Palestine, it kind of becomes up for grabs. World War II is going to weaken imperial powers further, so weaken other European powers who had decided to kind of run the Middle East after World War I. World War II also is going to, the Holocaust is part of that war, and that's going to lead the world to look and say, wait a minute, what do we do? We were all responsible in part for allowing the Germans to perpetrate the Holocaust, and so the United Nations looked and says, the world has disserved, has allowed the Jews to suffer this great event, what's the political solution, what's the geographic solution so that the Jewish people have a homeland? That is also complicated by sort of general broad decolonization and nationalist movements across the world in what we maybe call the third world or the developing world. As great empires of Britain and France collapse, these colonized people start to say, wait a minute, we want our voice to be heard. We want our national identities to be recognized. And that's going to be true of Jewish Zionism and true of kind of pan-Arab visions of an Arab state. And then we've got the Cold War, which complicates things also. The United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side, and almost every conflict on the planet being divided between you're either with the Americans or you're with the Soviets. And that in part is going to influence kind of strangely American policy in the Middle East and Soviet policy in the Middle East. And then, of course, after the Soviet Union collapses, we have this idea of a unipolar world where there's just the United States that's kind of in charge and running the show. But out of that, in that kind of new world order, you see these extreme versions of ethnic identity and national identity that have given rise to things like we could say Al-Qaeda and 9/11 and groups like ISIS, which are kind of unleashed in this unipolar post-Cold War world. I'm going to unfold talking about that, and it would be great if people do have questions. If they want to get in here, that'd be great. So we're going the wrong way. Let's go this way. Okay. The next two slides that you're going to see are part of the correspondence between the British government and the future stakeholders or the claimants to the land that is Palestine. As the British are struggling in a stalemate in Western Europe against the Germans, they look and they say, who's our weakest enemy out there in the First World War? And they see the Ottoman Empire kind of as being the weak underbelly of the Central Powers. And so they say, if we can kind of undermine the Ottomans, then the Germans are going to have to send troops from the Western Front into the Middle East. That'll free us up maybe to get some soft kind of movement in Western Europe. And so they try to, they're doing whatever, they're trying to do whatever they can, the British are. And so they say, let's stir up Arab nationalism within the Ottoman Empire. So let's encourage the Arabs to say, hey, this is Arab territory, this isn't Turkish Ottoman territory, and if you help us beat the Ottomans, we'll help you establish yourself a homeland so that the Middle East becomes a kingdom or an empire of the Arabs once again. And so the Sharif of Mecca and Major McMahon of the British Empire, and maybe some of you know Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence was part of this exchange correspondence where the Arabs say, we want independence, will you help us against the Ottomans? And the British say, we want to beat the Ottomans, and we will give you independence. This is an excerpted letter, but the full letter, you can almost do like a dot-to-dot, color-by-number map that, it says, okay, so here's your Middle East. So, okay, you want the whole thing. Well, this part's Turkish. You can't have that, but we go all the way across. That's Persia. You're not even asking for that. Go down, you want Iraq. Okay, and then you go across, and then you go up the Red Sea, and that is Palestine, right? So Palestine is in there. That Mediterranean coast is in what the British are saying you can have. The British say, they have some caveats. They're like, okay, so Jerusalem and other holy places, we got to let everybody who wants to go there go there. But if you can agree to that, this is the land that we promised to you. Which sounds pretty good, except when you take that color by number and you superimpose the color by number that comes from this map, you have a serious conflict that's built in, and this is unfolding 100 years ago, which in this history is not very long, right? So here, the British, a year later, promised to kind of the world Jewish population. They say, the British government says it's a great idea for the Jews to have a homeland in Palestine. And so these two documents can't really coexist, right? They're kind of mutually exclusive in terms of territory. It could be seen as devious. I think when we look at the context of the First World War, the British people, the British government was stuck in a devastating stalemate. So you have millions of young men being slaughtered on the killing fields of Western Europe. And the British are just like, let's just throw anything out there that'll work. So it's like, hey, Arabs, we're going to get you, help us beat the Ottomans. Maybe that'll help us break this stalemate. And then they're like, hey, there's a Jewish chemist who helped develop some explosives that are going to help us on the Western Front. So let's celebrate that by saying we think that Jews should have a homeland. Strangely, I think the British government thought that if they were to make this proposal to offer the land to the Jews, that the American Jewish populations would say, America, this is now a war to get the Jews a homeland. America, get into the war. And that, I think, speaks to some, I think, strange and I think anti-Semitic attitudes that the British had toward the world Jewish population. They're so influential over the economics and the press in the United States that clearly, if they see that the Jews will finally get a homeland, then they'll manipulate the press and they'll manipulate the president, and that'll get the United States in the war. It's a pretty outlandish theory, but the British government was in a pretty outlandish place, given how stuck they were in the First World War. But what happens is that these two promises complicate everything that comes, because both sides will look and say, wait a minute, we did what you asked, where's the stuff, where's the territory that we're supposed to get? So the war ends, the Ottoman Empire collapses, the Ottoman Empire is destroyed, and then the British government says, okay, well, let's talk to the French. And of course, Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab representatives are at the Paris Peace Conference saying, like, where's our peace? Like, we have these letters, we were promised this territory. And the UK and the French are like, yeah, but you guys aren't ready for independence yet. This isn't land that's ready to be managed by the Arab people, and it isn't land that is ready to be managed by the Jewish populations. And so the British create mandates, which are, they're not colonies, they're kind of like babysitter status, where the UK said, we're going to manage Palestine, we're going to manage Transjordan, which becomes the country of Jordan, and we're going to manage this territory that they call Iraq. And then France gets Syria and Lebanon. The idea behind the mandates is they will be managed by the French and the UK until such time as they are ready for self-government. But that until such time has a bit of an imperial tone, that it's the British and the French who are going to decide at what time these places are actually ready. So during this time, we move from, it's 1922 by the time these mandates are established, and there's a lot of changes going on in Europe during the 1920s and 30s. We see Germany greatly punished by the war and the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. And so many Jews start to look and say, what's happening in Germany makes Europe not a safe environment. And so there is many Jews who seek to migrate to Palestine, to say, it's under British control, it's our Holy Land, and it isn't Europe, and it isn't Germany, and we see this kind of militarist, expansionist, anti-Semitic Nazi party. And so there's an influx of Jews into Palestine, some with the hope of, if we establish territory here, if we move here, if we farm the land, and if we can say, look, there's a sizable Jewish population here, there'll be a point when the British government will say, oh, this Palestine is ready for independence, and there's a sizable Jewish population. They need to be a part of determining what this nation will be. At this time, they're buying up territory. So they're going and they're saying, I want to buy territory, I want to buy a farm or whatever it is. And Arab people who own the land but don't control the territory as a political entity are making private sales in the same way that you might sell your home to somebody. And many of the Jews are seeing, like, if we, the Jews, buy this territory up, then we become stakeholders in the land. And many of the Arabs just see it as, this is just a financial private transaction, and they don't see that situation as, we're selling our, what they see as their patrimony, we're selling our territory. But that's going to become, a confounding issue later on. So the Second World War happens. France and the UK on the winning side, France kind of, or Free France on the winning side, but France is a country devastated, the British government, the British nation devastated, and so too weak to hold on to their colonies, so they start to let go of their territories. And we see this kind of simultaneously giving up India and looking to say, we got to get out of managing Palestine. There's tension between the Arabs and Jews. We don't have the money to manage it. There's no economic benefit to holding on to it. So they kind of want to leave the region. You see the rise of decolonization with the Atlantic Charter, which some juniors might be familiar with. The winning powers, or the soon-to-be winning powers in World War II, it said, this is not going to be a war for territorial expansion. This is not going to be a war to create new empires, but this is really going to be a war that is truly about self-determination in a way that the First World War wasn't. And so they kind of make this resounding promise that, that peoples who are ruled by others will get a choice to rule themselves. And so this unleashes more Arab nationalism, but it also encourages the Jews to say, this is our chance to make Israel as a nation. The Holocaust, as I mentioned earlier, it's clear that the Nazis were responsible for the Holocaust, but as nations in Europe and as the United States start to look, they say, they begin to understand their role as bystanders that allowed this to happen, that the policy of appeasement allowed the Nazis to grow, that policies during the Great Depression that reduced immigration to the United States and to France and to Great Britain. They said, we don't want people from other countries coming to take jobs from people who are American citizens or British citizens or French citizens, but that ended up shutting the door for many Jews to escape the Holocaust. And so when the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, the major powers of the world, and I think people across the globe looked and said that can't be allowed to happen, that the Jews need protections, that the Jews, if they had had their own territory, an event like the Holocaust may not have happened. And then kind of outcome of the Second World War is the creation of the United Nations, which tries to address those issues of self-determination, that people should have countries. So in 1947, the United Nations proposes splitting Palestine between Arabs and Jews. So this is a proposal that is put out there, and almost immediately the Jewish populations raise their hand and say, we accept the partition, and it's a curious partition where the country's basically cut into an X. And so you get a little bit of the top and a little bit of the bottom, or a little bit of the side, a little bit of the side. And Jerusalem is kind of like the center, which is going to be an international city, kind of managed by the United Nations and protected so that anybody might go there. So the Jews accept the partition and declare independence. And the state of Israel is effectively created, except that the Arabs reject it. So the Palestinian Arabs, so the people who live in Palestine are Arab people, they say, no, it's called Palestine, it's our land. And the Arab neighbors, so we have independent Egypt, we have now independent Jordan, independent Syria, they, in support of the Palestinian Arab claims to the land, they attack Israel. And so Israel survives this, Palestine disappears. So that may introduce some questions that you guys have. That's the end of my slides. So I can take this anywhere you want to go. So if someone wants to say, what does this have to do with the occupied territories today? Or I know about the 6 Days War, or Netanyahu, or the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas, or anything, if people have questions. Otherwise, I can let people get to class. Great. So the question was, there's a two-state solution, and now I'm going to go to the other camera. It won't make any difference to you guys. So the two-state solution that's proposed would, well, let's explain a little bit further so that we can get to that two-state solution. So when war for Israeli independence happens, the territory that would have been given to the Palestinians ends up being taken by Egypt takes a piece, Syria takes a piece, and Jordan takes a piece, right? Then in 1967, there's the Six-Day War, which is complicated, and I'd love to do a talk about that at some point. The Israelis get information that there's going to be an Arab attack, invasion on the nation of Israel, so they attack first. And it's just, it's tragic in that, you know, depending on who you ask, it's like, well, if you're going to be attacked, can you defend yourself by attacking somebody? And, you know, we could go on and on arguing that. And, you know, well, we didn't attack, and maybe we were going to attack, but that doesn't mean they could have attacked us. So we see the kind of intractable nature of that. But as a result of the Six-Day War, Israel, the country, takes all of Palestine. So what was the West Bank, which had been controlled by Jordan, now falls under Israeli military control. The Gaza region, which had been taken by Egypt, falls under Israeli control. Those regions are smaller, those regions today, which are still, they're now managed by Palestinians, although some say they're occupied. Israel reserves the right to kind of militarily defend or respond in those areas. Those regions that the Palestinians live in are smaller than the regions proposed to Palestinians in the initial United Nations partition proposal. So if a two-state solution says, give Israel what Israel has now, but the territory is currently inhabited by Palestinians, so the West Bank and the Gaza Strip become a new Palestinian country. That country would be smaller than the UN proposal. And that, I think, is one of the sticking points for why Palestinians look and say, you know, we had a chance at something bigger, we're not going to take something smaller. But so the proposal for that is currently smaller than what it would have been in 47. John Luca. So the UN partition program never gets implemented. So it's, you know, I kind of see, I don't want to make, I kind of see this like, you know, the parent says, hey, we're going for a ride somewhere, you know, someone in the front seat, someone in the back seat, and one of the kids touches their nose first, and it's like, yes, and the other one's like, wait a minute, where's the dialogue here? So when the UN proposed it, the UN is a new thing at the time, and so its powers are uncertain, and its right to say, oh, here's what we're going to do with this territory, people could argue is questionable. So the UN partition plan doesn't get implemented. So it isn't, it's not at all, this doesn't unfold logically or in a planned manner. The UN says, hey, this is a proposal. One could imagine that they'd be like, okay, let's discuss, argue, debate about the territory lines. And Israel just looks at it and says, this is our chance for self-determination, for national identity, and they jump on it. The Palestinians and the Arab neighbors reject it. So there isn't a chance for the UN to set up some kind of mandatory you know, international city in Jerusalem that then comes into question. So it's not in play. So Jerusalem isn't in play in that way, or doesn't. The plan never gets implemented. Yes.
How were the Israelis able to defeat the Palestinians in war times in 27 just after the 28?
So that's a great question. There's a couple of different answers to that, and I think any answer that I give will somehow bring controversial responses. On the one hand, having the Jews at this point have a realization, like after the Holocaust, that like of survivorship. That it's like we have to dig our feet in, and we have to hold on to this because we have no allies. And yet, at the same time, both the Soviet Union and the United States, and this is where the Cold War complicates things, at the end of World War II, as the Cold War is unfolding and the United States and Russia or Soviet Union are determining what is their new relationship going to be, what's this new polarized world going to be like, both look at the possibility of the creation of Israel as a positive thing. The United States becomes a particular ally of Israel in terms of real economic support for its defense. And so, this is not a proxy war in the Cold War. So there aren't U.S. troops or Soviet troops fighting on either side. But there is aid to Israel from the United States. And if we look at the nature of Arab resistance or the Arab attack, there's unity in a common enemy, Israel, but there's disunity in terms of what each state wants. So what Egypt wants out of an attack on Israel isn't necessarily the creation of a Palestinian state, but as we see, Egypt gains some territory as a result of that. Likewise, Jordan isn't necessarily looking at saying, like, let's protect the Palestinians as much as we reject non-Arab ownership of this territory, right? And Syria, so those nations that are involved in the attack, the initial attack against Israel, are unified in their disapproval of Israel, but they have great disunity in terms of their individual national goals, and then the Palestinians aren't a nation. So I don't know if that fragmentation is understood, but that is a contributing factor, as well as United States support for the maintenance of Israel. Are there other questions? Yes, Mrs. Roth.
This is jumping ahead a bit chronologically, and maybe is a slightly bigger picture question, but to what extent is America's continued support a product of cultural or religious interests versus political or diplomatic interests now? Or is it all so muddied it's kind of hard to tell at this point?
So let me see if I understand that question completely. The United States, if people were paying attention to the news when the recently re-elected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in the United States, I think now 2 weeks ago, there's a great division in the United States about him and about Israel's role in American foreign policy. So the Republican Senate invited Netanyahu to speak. The president saw this as, a publicity stunt by Netanyahu and a way of just kind of the Republicans saying, we're so different from the Democratic president. So there's a division, I think, within even the United States in terms of support for Israel, or the extent to which we are willing to support Israel versus the extent to which we look toward a two-state solution. So there's that issue in terms of there isn't a single, how does the United States look at the issue? Like our situation, our political situation is maybe more polarized than it has been in the last 20 years or maybe more. And so your question, though, given that, your question was, is American support, U.S. support of Israel kind of cultural, historical now, and like we've been doing this for so long so that we need to continue doing this, or something else?
Cultural, religious, like based on religious interest, religious interest groups in the United States versus, it's our best ally in the region, it's our best foothold against other enemies in the region. Like I'm thinking more particularly in our financial support and our military support. So to what extent is it due to just sort of this is what we've always done, or this is our best political strategy in the region?
In some way I'm going to sidestep that, or maybe just address it in maybe a slightly different way. The Arab Spring, which now is 4 years on, was all about bringing kind of people within Arab nations, bringing democracy to their countries. The United States is, I think, a proponent, or wants to be seen as a proponent, and I think in many ways is a proponent of democracy worldwide, and Israel is the longest established, most democratic state in the region, and at times was the only democratic state in the region. And so that is, every time you look and there's a sense of like, okay, well, we support this country for this, or now there's a shift, and so we support this country for this. I think that's an important thing not to lose sight of, that Israel is not just an ally because we need a place to have, a military foothold, because we don't have a foothold there, right? Like, they are an independent nation that we don't bases there. There's not like kind of neo-imperialist relationship, I think. It is a democracy, and that's a value that America has, and that it is, in part, there's like, put our money where our mouth is in that case. Are there other complicating issues? Absolutely. And I don't know if we have time before class starts to address all of those complicating issues. But there is a history of support for Israel. And so even when Obama will say something like, I look toward the two-state solution as a viable way of giving all people their fair piece of the pie, he also will preface always with, Israel is our long-standing ally and our great friend, and will continue to be so. That bell might mean more or less it's time to wrap up, unless anybody has an additional question. Great, and I can put this. This I think will get broadcast, but also if you have a GCP site, or if you have a GCP Edmodo and you just want to have these slides up there, they'll certainly help anybody in the 10th grade with their studies in the rest of the spring. Thank you very much, everybody.